Tonight, we journey back through 40 centuries to walk among the world's first cities, where humans first learned to write their thoughts on clay, where kings first called themselves gods, and where empires rose and fell like the flooding rivers that gave this land its name. This is the story of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization itself. But before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes these ancient stories help us sleep. Other times they make us dream of distant times and forgotten kings. Tonight we'll cover over 4,000 years of human achievement, from the first Sumerian temples rising from the marshes to the Persian conquest that would change the world forever. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's explore together the land between the rivers. Chapter 1. The Land Between Two Rivers. In the beginning, there was only water and wind, endless marshes stretching toward horizons that shimmered in the heat. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers wound through this landscape like twin serpents, carrying life-giving silt from the mountains of Anatolia down to the Persian Gulf. But these were not gentle rivers. They flooded without warning, changed their courses on whims that seemed divine, and left behind both fertile soil and devastating destruction. It was here, in this challenging landscape, that the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning between the rivers, that humanity would first learn to live in cities, to read and write, to worship gods in temples that scraped the sky, and to organize themselves under kings who claimed divine authority. This was not an accident of geography, but a necessity born from the land itself. The annual floods that swept down from the mountains were both blessing and curse. They deposited rich alluvium across the plains, creating some of the most fertile soil on earth. But they also destroyed settlements, drowned livestock, and washed away entire seasons of work. To survive here, people had to learn cooperation on a scale never before attempted. They had to dig canals, build dikes, construct irrigation systems that could channel the river's power while protecting against their wrath. The earliest inhabitants we can identify lived here around 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic period. These were farming communities scattered along the riverbanks, people who had learned to domesticate wheat and barley, sheep and cattle. They lived in small mud brick houses, buried their dead with simple grave goods, and left behind pottery that shows their first attempts at artistic expression. But it was around 6,000 years ago that something extraordinary began to happen. The scattered villages started growing larger, their houses more complex, their pottery more sophisticated. They began to specialize, with some people becoming full-time craftsmen while others farmed or herded animals. Most importantly, they began to build temples, not just simple shrines, but elaborate structures that required coordinated effort from hundreds of people. The Ubaid culture, named after the site where archaeologists first discovered their distinctive painted pottery, spread across southern Mesopotamia around 5000 BC. These people developed the first irrigation systems, learned to work with metals, and created the social structures that would eventually evolve into the world's first cities. Their pottery shows remarkable artistic skill, decorated with geometric patterns and stylized animals that would influence Mesopotamian art for millennia to come. The landscape itself shaped the people who lived here. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile's floods were predictable and gentle, the Mesopotamian rivers were violent and unpredictable. This created a worldview where the gods were seen as capricious and potentially hostile, where life was uncertain and required constant vigilance. The rivers could bless you with abundant harvests or destroy everything you had built. They could shift their courses overnight, leaving your carefully constructed canals useless and your fields barren. To manage this environment required not just individual skill, but collective action. Entire communities had to work together to dig canals, maintain dikes, and share water resources fairly. This cooperation led to the development of complex social hierarchies, with leaders who could coordinate large-scale projects and priests who could interpret the will of the gods who controlled the rivers. The soil was rich, but challenged the builders in other ways. There was no stone in southern Mesopotamia, no wood except for the date palms that grew along the riverbanks. Everything had to be built from mud bricks, dried in the sun or fired in kilns. These bricks were strong enough to build impressive structures, but they required constant maintenance. Rain could dissolve them, floods could wash them away, and the settlements themselves would gradually rise on mounds of their own debris as old buildings crumbled and new ones were built on top. This constant cycle of destruction and rebuilding shaped Mesopotamian thinking about time and permanence. Nothing lasted forever in this landscape. Even the mightiest kings and the most magnificent cities would eventually return to mud. This awareness of impermanence runs through all Mesopotamian literature, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the pessimistic wisdom literature of later periods. The climate was harsh as well. Summer temperatures could reach well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was little rainfall. Everything depended on the rivers and the irrigation systems that channeled their water. The growing season was short, but intensely productive when properly managed. Barley grew well in the salty soil, and date palms provided both fruit and building material, but the margin for error was small, and poor planning or bad luck could mean starvation. Into this challenging environment came the Sumerians, though we're not entirely sure when or from where. They spoke a language unrelated to any other known language, wrote their thoughts on clay tablets in wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform, and built the world's first true cities. They called themselves the black-headed people, and referred to their land simply as the land, or sometimes the land of the civilized kings. By 3500 BC, Sumerian settlements had grown into genuine cities with populations in the tens of thousands. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, Babylon, Kish, and dozens of other cities dotted the landscape, each controlling the surrounding farmland, and each ruled by kings who claimed divine sanction for their authority. These weren't just large villages, but complex urban centers, with specialized districts for craftsmen, merchants, priests, and administrators. The rivers that had made this civilization possible also ensured it would never be isolated. The Tigris and Euphrates provided highways for trade and communication, connecting Mesopotamia to the mountains of Anatolia, the forests of Lebanon, the mines of Afghanistan, and the cities of the Indus Valley. By 3000 BC, Mesopotamian merchants were traveling thousands of miles, bringing back precious metals, rare stones, exotic woods, and new ideas. This geographical openness was both an advantage and a vulnerability. Trade brought wealth and cultural exchange, but it also brought invaders. The flat plains of Mesopotamia offered no natural defenses against armies approaching from any direction. Mountains bordered the land to the north and east, deserts to the west and south, but determined enemies could come from any of these directions. This constant threat of invasion shaped Mesopotamian military technology and political organization. The cities that arose in this landscape were marvels of engineering and organization. They were surrounded by massive walls, sometimes double or triple walls, with towers and gates that could withstand siege engines. Inside the walls were districts for different crafts and social classes, market areas where merchants from distant lands gathered to trade, and at the center, dominating everything, the ziggurat, the stepped temple tower where the city's patron god was believed to dwell. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of these early cities was their record-keeping. The need to manage complex irrigation systems, coordinate trade over vast distances, and administer large populations led to the development of writing. What began as simple pictographs marking quantities of grain or numbers of sheep gradually evolved into a sophisticated system capable of recording laws, literature, religious rituals, and royal chronicles. The invention of writing around 3200 BC marked the beginning of recorded history. For the first time, humans could preserve their thoughts, laws, stories, and knowledge for future generations. The clay tablets they wrote on have survived for thousands of years, giving us direct access to the voices of people who lived 5,000 years ago. We can read their letters, their business contracts, their prayers, their love poems, and their complaints about everything from taxation to the quality of copper ingots. This was the stage on which the great drama of Mesopotamian civilization would unfold, a story spanning more than 3 millennia, involving dozens of peoples and cultures, hundreds of kings and innovations that still shape our world today. It was a land where the first human settlements grew into the first cities, where the first writing systems allowed the first literature, where the first law codes attempted to create justice, and where the first empires demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of human organization on a vast scale. Chapter 2. The Dawn of Civilization. The Sumerian Beginnings. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 31st century before Christ, the priests of Eridu climbed the steps of the world's oldest temple, carrying offerings to Enki, god of the sweet waters beneath the earth. They had done this every morning for generations beyond counting, but they could not have known they were participating in the birth of civilization itself. Eridu was ancient even to the Sumerians, who believed it was the first city ever built, created by the gods themselves at the beginning of time. Archaeological evidence suggests they weren't far wrong. The temple at Eridu shows continuous use and rebuilding from around 4900 BC, making it one of the oldest religious sites in the world. But Eridu was just one of dozens of cities that arose in southern Mesopotamia during the 4th millennium BC, each developing its own character, its own patron deity, and its own approach to the challenges of urban life. The Sumerians, whose language remains unrelated to any other known human language, created more than just cities. They invented the concepts that still define civilization today. They developed the first known writing system, established the first schools, created the first literature, codified the first laws, built the first monumental architecture, and organized the first complex governments. They divided the day into 24 hours, the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds. They identified the zodiac and tracked the movements of the planets. They brewed the first beer, baked the first bread, and threw the first pottery on the first potter's wheels. But perhaps most importantly, they learned how to live together in large numbers. The earliest Sumerian cities housed populations that dwarfed anything that had existed before. Uruk, which may have been the world's first true city, reached a population of 50,000 people by 2900 BC, making it larger than London would be for another 3,000 years. Managing a population of this size required innovations in social organization, economic systems, and political structures that had never been attempted before. The foundation of Sumerian civilization was agriculture, but not the simple farming practiced by earlier peoples. The Sumerians developed intensive irrigation agriculture that could support population densities unprecedented in human history. They dug canals hundreds of miles long, built complex systems of dikes and levees, and created sophisticated techniques for measuring and distributing water. This agricultural revolution made possible the food surpluses that allowed people to specialize in non-agricultural occupations for the first time in human history. In the workshops of Sumerian cities, craftsmen developed techniques for working with copper, bronze, silver, and gold. They learned to make alloys that were stronger than pure metals, created tools and weapons of unprecedented sophistication, and produced luxury goods that were traded across the known world. Sumerian jewelry, weapons, and textiles have been found in archaeological sites from Afghanistan to Egypt, testimony to both their quality and the extensive trade networks that distributed them. The Sumerian religious system was complex and sophisticated, with hundreds of gods and goddesses governing every aspect of life and death. At the head of the pantheon stood An, god of the sky, whose name literally meant sky in Sumerian. Below him were Enlil, god of air and storms, Enki, god of water and wisdom, and Inanna, goddess of love and war. Each city had its own patron deity, who was believed to own the city and its surrounding farmland. The people of the city were considered servants of their god, working the divine estates in exchange for protection and prosperity. The most visible symbols of Sumerian civilization were the ziggurats, massive stepped temple towers that dominated the skylines of every major city. These weren't just religious buildings, but cosmic symbols representing the connection between earth and heaven. The ziggurat at Ur, built around 2100 BC, still stands nearly 4,000 years later, its mud brick core having outlasted countless stone buildings from later periods. The ziggurats were more than impressive architecture. They were the hearts of complex economic systems. The temples controlled vast estates, employed thousands of people, and operated as banks, schools, hospitals, and manufacturing centers. Temple priests weren't just religious figures, but administrators, economists, engineers, and scholars. They developed the mathematical and astronomical knowledge needed to maintain the calendar, predict floods, and plan agricultural operations. It was in these temple schools that the Sumerians developed the world's first system of formal education. Young scribes spent years learning to read and write cuneiform, studying mathematics, astronomy, literature, and law. The curriculum was demanding and standardized across the Sumerian world. Students learned to write by copying out literary texts, mathematical problems, and legal documents. They memorized hymns, prayers, proverbs, and mythological stories that preserved Sumerian culture and transmitted it from generation to generation. The literary achievements of the Sumerians were extraordinary. They created the world's first written literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells the story of a legendary king's quest for immortality. They wrote hymns to the gods, love songs, laments for destroyed cities, wisdom literature, and historical chronicles. One of the most remarkable Sumerian literary figures was Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who served as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur around 2300 BC. She is the first known author in human history, and her hymns to the goddess Inanna are among the finest examples of ancient literature. The political organization of Sumerian civilization was unique in human history. Rather than being unified under a single ruler, Sumer consisted of dozens of independent city-states, each controlling its own territory and governing its own people. These city-states were in constant competition with each other, forming alliances, fighting wars, and struggling for dominance over their neighbors. This political fragmentation created a dynamic, competitive environment that fostered innovation and cultural development. Each city-state was ruled by an ensai or lugal, terms that meant something like governor or big man. These rulers combined religious, political, and military authority, serving as high priests of their city's patron deity, while also commanding armies and administering government. The institution of kingship in Sumer was seen as divinely ordained, but not necessarily hereditary. Kings could rise from relatively humble backgrounds if they proved their worth in war or administration. The Sumerian legal system was sophisticated and humane for its time. Although no complete Sumerian law code survives, legal documents and court records show a system based on precedent, testimony, and compensation rather than revenge. Sumerian law recognized different social classes, but provided legal protection for all free citizens. Women had significant legal rights, including the ability to own property, operate businesses, and serve as witnesses in court. Trade was the lifeblood of Sumerian civilization. The rivers provided highways for transportation, and Sumerian merchants traveled throughout the known world, seeking raw materials that weren't available locally. They brought copper from Anatolia, tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from Central Asia, carnelian from India, and gold from Egypt. In return, they exported textiles, metalwork, jewelry, and manufactured goods. This extensive trade network spread Sumerian cultural influence far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were accomplished engineers and architects. They invented the potter's wheel, the sailboat, and the wheeled cart. They developed sophisticated techniques for working with metals, creating alloys and tools that wouldn't be improved upon for centuries. They built the world's first domed buildings, created elaborate drainage systems, and constructed massive public works projects that required coordination of thousands of workers. In astronomy, the Sumerians made observations and calculations that laid the foundation for all later astronomical work. They identified the zodiac, tracked the movements of the planets, and developed mathematical techniques for predicting celestial events. Their calendar was based on careful observation of lunar and solar cycles, and they were among the first to recognize that the year was approximately 365 days long. Sumerian mathematics was remarkably sophisticated, based on a sexagesimal, base 60 system that we still use today for measuring time and angles. They developed techniques for solving complex mathematical problems, including early forms of algebra and geometry. Their mathematical knowledge was essential for the engineering projects that made their civilization possible, from calculating the volume of irrigation canals to determining the materials needed for massive construction projects. The Sumerian worldview was both pessimistic and realistic. They saw humans as created by the gods to be servants, doomed to struggle against forces beyond their control. Death was the great leveler, and even heroes like Gilgamesh could not escape mortality. The afterlife was conceived as a dark, dreary place where the dead continued to exist, but without the pleasures of earthly life. This gloomy vision was balanced by a practical approach to life that emphasized the importance of human relationships, the pleasure of good food and drink, and the satisfaction of accomplishment. Despite their achievements, the Sumerians gradually lost political control of Mesopotamia to Semitic peoples from the north and west. By 2000 BC, Sumerian was no longer spoken as a living language, though it continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes for another 2,000 years. But their cultural achievements survived and influenced every subsequent civilization in Mesopotamia and beyond. The Sumerian legacy is enormous and enduring. They invented the forms of government, religion, law, literature, and technology that would shape human civilization for millennia to come. When we use our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles, when we read epic literature or watch the planets in their courses, when we live in cities or study in schools, we are participating in traditions that began in the Sumerian cities of ancient Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. Chapter 3. The Age of Conquest, the Akkadian Empire, around 2334 BC, in the northern city of Kish, a cupbearer named Sargon looked out over the prosperous but divided Sumerian city-states and envisioned something that had never existed before: a single empire that would unite all of Mesopotamia under one ruler. Within 56 years of rule, he would create the world's first multi-ethnic empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and establish a model of imperial government that would influence rulers for the next 2 millennia. Sargon's origins were humble, or at least he claimed they were. Like many great conquerors, he crafted a legend around his birth that emphasized his rise from obscurity. According to this legend, preserved in both Akkadian and later Assyrian versions, Sargon was born in secret to a priestess who placed him in a basket of reeds and set him adrift on the river. He was found by Aki, a water drawer, who raised him as his own son. The goddess Ishtar loved Sargon, and through her favor, he rose from his position as a gardener to become cupbearer to the king of Kish, and finally king himself. Whether or not this birth legend is historically accurate, it served an important political purpose. Sargon was not born to rule, had no hereditary claim to kingship, and belonged to a Semitic people who were largely subjects of the Sumerian city-states. His legend explained how divine favor could elevate a man of humble birth to rule over kings, and it provided a model that later conquerors would frequently imitate. The Akkadians were Semitic people who had been living in northern Mesopotamia for generations alongside the Sumerians. They spoke a different language, worshipped some different gods, and had their own cultural traditions. But they had also absorbed much Sumerian learning. Akkadian scribes wrote in cuneiform script, Akkadian artists used Sumerian artistic conventions, and Akkadian rulers claimed divine sanction in the Sumerian manner. This cultural fusion would be one of Sargon's greatest advantages in building his empire. Sargon's military innovations were as important as his political vision. Previous Mesopotamian armies had been primarily composed of part-time soldiers, farmers, who were called up for brief campaigns during the agricultural off-season. Sargon created the world's first professional army, soldiers who were paid from the royal treasury and could campaign year-round. He also developed new military technologies, including the composite bow, which could shoot arrows farther and with more accuracy than previous weapons. The conquest began with Sargon's defeat of Lugalzagesi, the king of Umma, who had recently managed to gain control over most of the major Sumerian cities. In a series of brilliant campaigns, Sargon defeated Lugalzagesi's forces, captured the king himself, and systematically conquered every major Sumerian city-state. But unlike previous conquerors, who had been content to exact tribute and withdraw, Sargon established permanent control over his conquests. The key to Sargon's success was his administrative system. Rather than simply imposing Akkadian rule on conquered territories, he created a synthesis of Akkadian and Sumerian governmental traditions. He kept local administrators in place when they proved competent and loyal, but he also installed his own governors in key positions. Most famously, he appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur, one of the most important religious positions in Sumer. Enheduanna was more than just a symbol of Akkadian rule. She was a remarkable individual in her own right. As the world's first known author whose name we know, she composed hymns to the goddess Inanna that were masterpieces of ancient literature. Her hymns served both religious and political purposes, praising Inanna while also legitimizing her father's rule and the fusion of Akkadian and Sumerian religious traditions. Through her position and her writings, Enheduanna helped create a unified religious and cultural identity that could encompass both Semitic and Sumerian peoples. Sargon's empire was not merely a collection of tribute-paying vassals, but an integrated political and economic system. He standardized weights and measures throughout his territories, facilitating trade across vast distances. He built roads and established way stations for merchants and government messengers. He created a postal system that could carry communications from one end of his empire to the other. These innovations made possible an unprecedented level of economic integration and cultural exchange. Trade flourished under Sargonian rule as never before. Akkadian merchants traveled from the silver mines of Anatolia to the lapis lazuli deposits of Afghanistan, from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the copper mines of Oman. The empire's central location gave it control over trade routes linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. Taxes on this trade filled the imperial treasury and funded the armies and public works projects that held the empire together. The cultural achievements of the Akkadian period were extraordinary. The synthesis of Akkadian and Sumerian traditions created new forms of art, literature, and religious expression. Akkadian sculptors developed a new naturalistic style that emphasized individual characterization and emotional expression. The famous bronze head discovered at Nineveh, probably representing either Sargon or his grandson Naram-Sin, shows a level of artistic sophistication that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Akkadian literature built on Sumerian foundations but developed its own distinctive character. The earliest versions of what would become the Epic of Gilgamesh were composed during this period, transforming Sumerian legends into a coherent narrative. about human mortality and the quest for meaning. Akkadian writers also created new genres of historical writing, composing chronicles of royal achievements and campaign accounts that provided models for later imperial propaganda. The religious synthesis achieved during the Akkadian period was equally significant. Akkadian gods were identified with their Sumerian counterparts, creating a unified pantheon that could be worshipped throughout the empire. Ishtar, the Akkadian goddess of love and war, was identified with the Sumerian Inanna. Marduk, who would later become the chief god of Babylon, first achieved prominence as an Akkadian deity. This religious fusion helped create a shared cultural identity that transcended ethnic boundaries. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, brought the Akkadian Empire to its greatest extent and power. He was the first Mesopotamian king to declare himself a god during his lifetime, taking the title King of the Four Quarters, and having his name written with the divine determinative used for gods. This was a revolutionary claim that went far beyond traditional Mesopotamian concepts of kingship, and it established a precedent that would influence imperial ideology for millennia to come. Under Naram-Sin, Akkadian armies campaigned from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean Sea, from Anatolia to the Arabian Peninsula. The empire controlled virtually every major trade route in the ancient Near East and extracted tribute from peoples as far away as the Indus Valley. Naram-Sin's victory stele, discovered at Susa, where it had been taken as booty by later Elamite conquerors, shows the king climbing a mountain to receive victory from the gods, trampling his enemies beneath his feet. But the very success of the Akkadian Empire contained the seeds of its destruction. The empire was too large to be effectively controlled with ancient communication and transportation technology. Rebellions were frequent and costly to suppress. The professional army that had made conquest possible was expensive to maintain and consumed resources that might have been used for productive purposes. Most critically, the empire was vulnerable to environmental disasters that could disrupt the agricultural base on which everything depended. Around 2200 BC, a severe drought affected the entire region, possibly related to a global climate change event. Crop failures led to famine, famine led to rebellion, and rebellion led to the empire's rapid disintegration. The Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains, invaded Mesopotamia and destroyed Akkadian power. For nearly a century, Mesopotamia was fragmented and politically chaotic, a period remembered in later literature as a time of barbarism and cultural decline. Yet the Akkadian achievement was not forgotten. Later, Mesopotamian rulers consistently looked back to Sargon as the model of the ideal king, and Akkadian became the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East for over 1,000 years. The governmental, military, and cultural innovations of the Akkadian period provided the foundation for every subsequent Mesopotamian empire. The Akkadian Empire demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of imperial government. For the first time in human history, diverse peoples speaking different languages and worshipping different gods had been united under a single government that provided peace, prosperity, and cultural exchange. But the empire also showed how quickly such achievements could be lost when environmental disasters, administrative failures, or military defeats disrupted the delicate balance that held everything together. Sargon's legacy was not just political, but cultural and intellectual. The Akkadian Empire created the first truly international civilization, one that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. It established diplomatic and trade relationships that connected civilizations from the Indus Valley to Egypt. It created new forms of art, literature, and religious expression that would influence human culture for millennia. Most importantly, it proved that large-scale political organization was possible and could bring real benefits to the peoples it encompassed. Chapter 4. Laws and Legacy. The Babylonian Empire. In the year 1792 BC, a young Amorite prince named Hammurabi inherited the throne of Babylon, a modest city-state controlling no more than 50 square miles of territory along the Euphrates River. When he died 50 years later, he ruled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia, and had created a legal code that would influence human jurisprudence for the next 4,000 years. Babylon itself was not an ancient city by Mesopotamian standards. It had been founded sometime around 2300 BC, during the period of Akkadian dominance, and had remained a relatively minor settlement for centuries. What made Babylon significant was not its age, but its location. Situated at the narrowest point between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, it controlled the most important crossing point in central Mesopotamia and commanded the trade routes that connected the resource-rich north with the agricultural south. The Amorites who came to rule Babylon were one of many Semitic peoples, who had migrated into Mesopotamia during the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and the chaotic Gutian period that followed. Unlike the Akkadians, who had been gradually assimilated into Sumerian civilization for generations, the Amorites were relative newcomers who brought their own traditions and perspectives to Mesopotamian culture. They were originally semi-nomadic peoples from the Syrian desert who had gradually settled in cities throughout Mesopotamia during the 21st and 20th centuries BC. When Hammurabi came to power, Mesopotamia was politically fragmented among dozens of competing kingdoms and city-states. The most powerful rulers were Rim-Sin of Larsa, who controlled much of the old Sumerian heartland, Shamshi-Adad of Assyria, who dominated northern Mesopotamia, and various Elamite kings who controlled the eastern mountains. Hammurabi began his reign as a minor player in this complex political game, but he possessed extraordinary skills as both a diplomat and a military commander. For the first 30 years of his reign, Hammurabi carefully built his power through a combination of military campaigns, diplomatic alliances, and internal reforms. He strengthened Babylon's defenses, improved its irrigation systems, and established his capital as a center of learning and culture. He formed alliances with some neighbors while carefully preparing for eventual conflicts with others. Most importantly, he spent decades studying the weaknesses of his more powerful rivals and waiting for the right moment to act. The opportunity came when Rim-Sin of Larsa, who had dominated southern Mesopotamia for over 60 years, finally grew old and began to lose his grip on power. In a series of brilliant campaigns, Hammurabi conquered Larsa, Eshnunna, and finally the great city of Mari, bringing virtually all of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control. These weren't just military victories, but carefully planned political operations that left Hammurabi in control of functioning administrative systems rather than devastated territories. What made Hammurabi's empire different from its predecessors was not just its extent, but its internal organization. Rather than simply extracting tribute from conquered territories, Hammurabi created a unified legal and administrative system that provided predictable governance throughout his domains. He established royal courts in major cities, appointed professional judges, and most famously promulgated a comprehensive law code that applied to all his subjects regardless of their ethnic or cultural background. The Code of Hammurabi was not the world's first law code, but it was the most comprehensive and influential legal document of the ancient world. Inscribed on a black basalt stele, over 7 feet tall, the code contained 282 laws covering everything from commercial transactions to family relationships, from property rights to criminal justice. The stele was placed in the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, where anyone who could read could study its provisions. What made Hammurabi's code revolutionary was not just its comprehensiveness, but its underlying principles. Unlike earlier legal traditions that relied heavily on compensation for injuries, Hammurabi's code emphasized proportional punishment, based on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. The famous principle of an eye for an eye applied primarily to conflicts between social equals, while different punishments were prescribed for crimes involving people of different social classes. The code recognized 3 main social classes: the Awilu or free citizens, the Mushkanu or dependent workers, and the Wardu or slaves. Each class had different rights and responsibilities under the law, but even slaves were protected from arbitrary abuse by their masters. Women had significant legal rights, including the ability to own property, engage in business, and seek divorce under certain circumstances. The code also provided for the protection of widows and orphans who might otherwise have been defenseless in ancient society. Commercial law was particularly sophisticated in Hammurabi's code, reflecting the importance of trade in Babylonian society. The code regulated contracts, partnerships, banking operations, and commercial transportation. It established standard weights and measures, provided for the enforcement of contracts across great distances, and created legal mechanisms for resolving disputes between merchants from different cities or kingdoms. These provisions facilitated trade throughout the empire and beyond, contributing to an unprecedented level of economic integration. The administration of justice under Hammurabi was remarkably advanced for its time. Professional judges were appointed by the king and held accountable for their decisions. Court procedures were standardized, and written records were maintained of all legal proceedings. Witnesses were required to swear oaths before testifying, and perjury was severely punished. Appeals could be made to higher courts, and ultimately to the king himself in cases of exceptional importance. Religious life flourished under Babylonian rule, as Hammurabi skillfully blended Amorite, Akkadian, and Sumerian religious traditions. Marduk, originally a relatively minor Babylonian deity, was elevated to become the head of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The creation epic Enuma Elish, composed during this period, tells how Marduk defeated the primordial chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her body. This myth served not just religious purposes but political ones, legitimizing Marduk's supremacy and by extension Babylon's dominance over other Mesopotamian cities. The cultural achievements of the Babylonian period were extraordinary. Scholars in Hammurabi's capital copied and preserved the great literary works of earlier periods, while creating new forms of expression. Babylonian astronomers made observations and calculations that laid the foundation for all later astronomical work. Mathematicians developed sophisticated techniques for solving complex problems, including early forms of algebra and trigonometry. The base 60 number system developed in Sumerian times was refined and systematized, creating mathematical tools that remained in use for millennia. Education expanded dramatically under Babylonian rule. Schools were established throughout the empire, not just in major cities, but in smaller towns as well. The curriculum was standardized, with students learning to read and write cuneiform, studying mathematics and astronomy, memorizing literary texts, and learning the legal and administrative procedures necessary for government service. This educational system created a literate bureaucracy, capable of managing the complex affairs of a large empire. Architecture and engineering reached new heights during the Babylonian period. Hammurabi rebuilt Babylon on a grand scale, constructing massive walls, elaborate gates, and magnificent temples. The city was laid out on a rational plan with straight streets, proper drainage, and designated areas for different activities. The famous Ishtar Gate, built later but in the Babylonian tradition, gives us some idea of the architectural splendor that characterized the city during its golden age. The economic prosperity of the Babylonian Empire was based on a combination of agriculture, manufacturing, and trade. The empire controlled the most fertile agricultural regions of Mesopotamia, producing food surpluses that could support large urban populations. Babylonian craftsmen were renowned for their skill in working with metals, textiles, and luxury goods. The empire's central location made it a natural hub for trade between East and West, North and South, and Babylonian merchants operated throughout the known world. Yet for all its achievements, Hammurabi's empire was relatively short-lived. The same environmental and economic pressures that had destroyed the Akkadian Empire continued to threaten Mesopotamian civilization. Hammurabi's successors lacked his political and military skills, and the empire gradually lost territory to new waves of invaders. The Hittites sacked Babylon in 1595 BC, ending Amorite rule, and for several centuries Mesopotamia was dominated by the Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains. But the Babylonian achievement was not forgotten. Hammurabi's legal code continued to be copied and studied for over 1,000 years after his death, influencing legal development throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. The administrative and governmental innovations of the Babylonian period provided models for later empires. Most importantly, the synthesis of diverse cultural traditions achieved during Hammurabi's reign created a distinctively Mesopotamian civilization that would survive political changes and continue to evolve for another millennium and a half. The Code of Hammurabi represents one of humanity's first attempts to create a rational, systematic approach to justice. While its provisions may seem harsh by modern standards, they represented a significant advance over the arbitrary justice that had characterized earlier periods. The code's influence can be traced through subsequent legal traditions, including those that eventually influenced the development of Western law. Chapter 5. The Iron Fist, the Assyrian Empire. In the northern city of Ashur, beside the swift-flowing Tigris River, the priests performed the same ritual every day at dawn. They carried offerings to their god, also called Ashur, and prayed for his protection over his chosen people. For over 1,000 years, this small city-state had struggled for survival in a world dominated by more powerful neighbors. But around 911 BC, under King Adad-nirari II, something changed. The Assyrians stopped merely defending themselves and began the conquest that would create the largest empire the world had yet seen. The rise of Assyrian power was not sudden, but the result of centuries of gradual development. The city of Ashur had been inhabited since around 2500 BC, and by 2000 BC it was the center of an extensive trading network that reached from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Assyrian merchants established trading posts throughout the ancient world, developing the commercial and organizational skills that would later serve their military expansion. What made the Assyrians different from their neighbors was their response to the constant military pressure they faced. Surrounded by enemies and lacking the natural defenses of mountains or seas, they developed the most sophisticated military machine the ancient world had ever seen. Every aspect of Assyrian society was organized around warfare, from the education of children to the administration of conquered territories. The Assyrian army was a professional force unlike anything that had existed before. While other ancient armies were composed primarily of farmers called up for seasonal campaigns, the Assyrian military was a full-time profession supported by the state. Soldiers were recruited from throughout the empire, trained intensively, and equipped with the finest weapons and armor that technology could provide. The army was organized into specialized units, each trained for specific types of warfare and coordinated through a sophisticated command structure. Iron technology gave the Assyrians a crucial advantage over enemies still equipped with bronze weapons. Assyrian smiths had mastered the techniques of ironworking earlier than most of their neighbors, and they used this knowledge to equip their armies with iron weapons that were stronger and held their edge longer than bronze alternatives. Iron was also more abundant than the copper and tin needed to make bronze, allowing the Assyrians to arm larger numbers of troops. But technology alone did not explain Assyrian success. Their military innovations were equally important. They developed new siege techniques that could reduce the strongest fortifications, including mobile siege towers, battering rams, and mining operations that could collapse city walls. They were among the first to use cavalry effectively in battle, combining the mobility of horsemen with the shock power of chariots. Their archers were trained to unprecedented levels of accuracy and could deliver devastating volleys that broke enemy formations before hand-to-hand fighting began. The Assyrian approach to warfare was as much psychological as physical. They deliberately cultivated a reputation for extreme cruelty, not just to intimidate enemies, but to discourage resistance and rebellion. Assyrian royal inscriptions describe in graphic detail the punishments inflicted on captured enemies: flaying alive, impalement, mass deportation, and the destruction of entire cities. Whether or not these accounts are entirely accurate, they served their purpose of making Assyrian conquest seem inevitable and resistance futile. Assyrian expansion began in earnest under Ashur-nasir-pal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BC. His campaigns took Assyrian armies from the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean Sea, conquering territory that had been independent for centuries. But Ashur-nasir-pal was not just a destroyer. He was also a builder who used the wealth gained from conquest to create a magnificent new capital at Kalhu, modern Nimrud. The palace at Kalhu was designed to impress both subjects and foreign ambassadors with the power and glory of Assyrian kingship. Its walls were lined with carved relief sculptures depicting royal hunts, military campaigns, and religious ceremonies. These reliefs serve as both art and propaganda, showing the king as a mighty warrior blessed by the gods and capable of defeating any enemy. The famous lion hunt reliefs show Ashurnasirpal personally killing lions with bow and spear, demonstrating his prowess as a hunter and by extension his fitness to rule. The administrative system that held the Assyrian Empire together was as sophisticated as its military machine. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials appointed by and responsible to the king. These governors were frequently moved from one province to another to prevent them from developing local loyalties that might threaten central authority. A sophisticated intelligence network kept the king informed of developments throughout the empire, and a system of roads and relay stations allowed rapid communication across vast distances. One of the most controversial aspects of Assyrian rule was their policy of mass deportation. When cities or regions rebelled, the Assyrians would forcibly relocate entire populations, moving them to distant parts of the empire where they could be more easily controlled. This policy served multiple purposes. It broke up potential resistance movements, provided labor for construction projects in other parts of the empire, and created a cosmopolitan population that was dependent on the central government rather than loyal to local traditions. The reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, from 745 to 727 BC, marked the transformation of Assyria from a regional power to a truly imperial state. Tiglath-Pileser reorganized the army, the administration, and the entire structure of government to support continuous expansion and control over vast territories. He created a standing army that could campaign year-round, established a professional bureaucracy capable of governing diverse populations, and developed economic policies that could extract wealth from conquered territories without destroying their productivity. Under Tiglath-Pileser and his successors, the Assyrian Empire expanded to unprecedented size. Sargon II conquered Cyprus and parts of Anatolia. Sennacherib campaigned in the Levant and extracted tribute from Egypt. Esarhaddon actually conquered Egypt, making the Assyrian Empire the first to control territory on 3 continents. At its height under Ashurbanipal, the empire controlled virtually every major urban center, from the Iranian plateau to the Nile Delta. The cultural achievements of the Assyrian Empire were as impressive as its military conquests. Assyrian scribes collected and preserved the literature of all previous Mesopotamian civilizations, creating libraries that served as repositories for human knowledge. The greatest of these was Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, which contained over 30,000 cuneiform tablets covering every aspect of ancient learning: literature, religion, science, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. Assyrian art developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the martial character of their civilization. Palace reliefs emphasized royal power, military victory, and divine sanction. Sculpture became increasingly naturalistic, with careful attention to anatomical detail and individual characterization. The famous wounded lioness from Ashurbanipal's palace at Nineveh, dragging her paralyzed hindquarters while still snarling defiance, is one of the masterpieces of ancient art. The Assyrians were also skilled engineers and architects. They built massive cities with sophisticated water supply systems, elaborate fortifications, and monumental architecture. Nineveh, rebuilt by Sennacherib as a worthy capital for a world empire, covered over 1,800 acres and may have housed a population of over 100,000 people. Its walls, gates, and palaces impressed visitors from throughout the known world. Religious life in the Assyrian Empire reflected its imperial character. While maintaining their devotion to Ashur as their national god, the Assyrians incorporated deities from throughout their empire into their religious system. This religious synthesis helped legitimize their rule over diverse populations while maintaining the distinctively Assyrian character of their civilization. Yet the very success of the Assyrian Empire contained the seeds of its destruction. The empire was held together by force, and when that force faltered, the empire disintegrated rapidly. The cost of maintaining large armies and extensive bureaucracies strained the imperial economy. Constant warfare exhausted Assyrian manpower and made the empire dependent on foreign troops whose loyalty was questionable. Most critically, Assyrian brutality created enemies who were willing to risk everything for revenge. The end came quickly after Ashurbanipal's death in 627 BC. Civil war between his sons weakened central authority, and rebellions broke out throughout the empire. In 626 BC, Nabopolassar established a new dynasty in Babylon and allied himself with the Medes of Iran. Together, they besieged and captured Nineveh in 612 BC, destroying the Assyrian capital so thoroughly that its location was forgotten for over 2,000 years. The fall of the Assyrian Empire was greeted with celebration throughout the ancient world. The prophet Nahum expressed the feelings of many when he wrote, "Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and robbery. Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her?" Yet despite the hatred it inspired, the Assyrian Empire had created institutions and precedents that would influence imperial government for centuries to come. The Assyrian legacy was both positive and negative. They created the first truly international empire, one that brought diverse peoples under a single government and facilitated cultural and economic exchange on an unprecedented scale. Their administrative innovations provided models for later empires, and their preservation of earlier literature ensured that the cultural achievements of previous civilizations would not be lost. At the same time, their reputation for cruelty and their reliance on force rather than consent created a model of imperial government that would inspire fear and hatred for generations. Chapter 6. The Final Glory, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In the ruins of Nineveh, as smoke still rose from the burned palaces of the Assyrian kings, Nabopolassar of Babylon surveyed the destruction and saw opportunity. The greatest empire the world had known lay shattered, its territories scattered among victorious allies. But Nabopolassar had grander visions than merely dividing the spoils of victory. He dreamed of restoring Babylonian greatness, of making his capital the greatest city on earth, and of ruling an empire that would surpass even Assyrian achievements in wealth and magnificence. The Neo-Babylonian Empire that Nabopolassar founded in 626 BC was built on the ruins of Assyrian power, but drew its inspiration from much older Babylonian traditions. Unlike the Assyrians, who had been relative newcomers to Mesopotamian civilization, the Babylonians could claim legitimacy as heirs to Hammurabi and the ancient Sumerian city-states. This connection to the past was both a source of strength and a foundation for the cultural renaissance that would characterize the Neo-Babylonian period. Nabopolassar himself was a Chaldean, a member of one of the Aramaic-speaking tribes that had settled in southern Mesopotamia during the late Assyrian period. The Chaldeans had gradually assimilated into Babylonian society while maintaining their own cultural traditions and political organization. They were particularly skilled in astronomy and mathematics, fields in which they would make significant contributions during the Neo-Babylonian period. The new empire that emerged from the collapse of Assyrian power was built on a foundation of careful diplomacy rather than pure military force. Nabopolassar maintained his alliance with the Medes, who controlled the Iranian plateau and established friendly relations with Egypt and other regional powers. This diplomatic approach allowed the Neo-Babylonians to consolidate their control over Mesopotamia and the Levant, without the constant warfare that had exhausted Assyrian resources. The reign of Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, from 605 to 562 BC, marked the height of Neo-Babylonian power and prosperity. Nebuchadnezzar was both a successful military commander and a visionary builder who transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city of the ancient world. Under his rule, the Neo-Babylonian Empire reached its greatest extent, controlling territory from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns were carefully planned operations designed to secure strategic territories and commercial routes, rather than simply to conquer for the sake of conquest. His most famous campaign was the siege and capture of Jerusalem in 586 BC, which ended the Kingdom of Judah and resulted in the exile of much of the Jewish population to Babylon. This event, known as the Babylonian captivity, was traumatic for the Jewish people, but also led to important developments in Jewish religious thought and literature. The prosperity of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was based on its control of trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Babylon's location at the center of these trade networks made it a natural entrepot, where merchants from distant lands gathered to exchange goods and ideas. The empire taxed this trade heavily, generating the enormous wealth that funded Nebuchadnezzar's construction projects and supported the lavish lifestyle of the Babylonian court. The Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt was designed to be the greatest city on earth, a worthy capital for a world empire and a testament to the power of its king. The city was surrounded by massive walls that ancient sources claimed were so wide that 2 four-horse chariots could pass each other on top. 8 bronze gates provided access to the city, the most magnificent of which was the Ishtar Gate, decorated with glazed brick reliefs of dragons and bulls in brilliant blue, yellow, and white. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were supposedly built by Nebuchadnezzar for his wife Amytis, who missed the green hills of her native Media. These elaborate terraced gardens, watered by a sophisticated hydraulic system, created an artificial mountain of greenery in the heart of the Mesopotamian plain. Whether or not the Hanging Gardens actually existed as described by ancient sources, they represent the pinnacle of Neo-Babylonian engineering and artistic achievement. The centerpiece of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was the great ziggurat known as Etemenanki, the Tower of Babel mentioned in Hebrew literature. This massive structure rose over 300 feet above the city, its 7 stages representing the 7 levels of heaven and earth. The ziggurat served both religious and political purposes, demonstrating Babylonian piety while also proclaiming the power of the king who could command the resources to build such monuments. Religious life in the Neo-Babylonian Empire was characterized by both continuity with ancient traditions and significant innovations. Marduk remained the chief god of Babylon, but his worship was elaborated with new rituals and festivals that emphasized his role as king of the gods and protector of the empire. The New Year festival, during which the Enuma Elish creation epic was recited and the king's authority was ritually renewed, became one of the most important celebrations in the ancient world. The Neo-Babylonians were particularly distinguished by their achievements in astronomy and mathematics. Building on earlier Mesopotamian traditions, Babylonian astronomers made observations and calculations that laid the foundation for all later astronomical work. They developed sophisticated mathematical techniques for predicting planetary motions, created the zodiac system still used today, and compiled astronomical records that were consulted by scholars for centuries afterward. The cultural achievements of the Neo-Babylonian period extended beyond astronomy and mathematics, to include significant developments in law, literature, and the arts. Neo-Babylonian scribes copied and preserved the literary works of earlier periods while creating new compositions that reflected contemporary concerns. Legal documents from this period show a sophisticated commercial law that facilitated trade throughout the empire and beyond. One of the most remarkable aspects of Neo-Babylonian culture was its cosmopolitanism. The empire included peoples speaking dozens of different languages and practicing various religious traditions. Rather than attempting to impose uniformity, the Neo-Babylonians generally allowed local customs and beliefs to continue while requiring political loyalty and tribute payment. This tolerance helped maintain stability within the empire while fostering cultural exchange and innovation. The Jewish exile in Babylon, though traumatic for those who experienced it, led to important developments in Jewish thought and religious practice. Living in a foreign land among people of different beliefs, Jewish scholars developed new ways of understanding their relationship with God and their identity as a people. Much of the Hebrew Bible was edited and compiled during this period, and many of the theological concepts that would later influence Christianity and Islam were first articulated by Jewish thinkers living in Babylonian cities. The economic prosperity of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was supported by sophisticated banking and commercial institutions. Babylonian banks could transfer funds across vast distances, provide credit for commercial ventures, and maintain accounts for merchants operating throughout the known world. The Murashu archive from Nippur provides detailed information about these commercial operations and shows the complexity of the economic system that supported Neo-Babylonian power. Agriculture remained the foundation of the empire's economy, but it was agriculture organized on an unprecedented scale and sophistication. The irrigation systems that supported Mesopotamian civilization were expanded and improved, allowing for increased agricultural productivity that could support large urban populations. Agricultural surpluses were carefully managed through a system of state granaries that could provide security against crop failures and fund military campaigns. Yet despite its wealth and sophistication, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was vulnerable to the same forces that had destroyed its predecessors. The empire was large and difficult to defend, requiring constant vigilance against both external enemies and internal rebellion. The cost of maintaining the elaborate capital and supporting the royal court strained imperial resources. Most critically, the Empire lacked the military traditions that had sustained Assyrian power and was vulnerable to attack by more warlike neighbors. The end came during the reign of Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king, whose unorthodox religious policies and extended absences from Babylon created political instability. When Cyrus of Persia invaded Mesopotamia in 539 BC, many Babylonians welcomed him as a liberator rather than an enemy. The Persian conquest was accomplished with minimal fighting, ending the Neo-Babylonian Empire but preserving much of its cultural achievement. The legacy of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was profound and enduring. Its astronomical and mathematical achievements provided the foundation for later Greek and Islamic science. Its architectural innovations influenced building throughout the ancient world. Its religious and cultural synthesis created traditions that survived long after the empire itself had disappeared. Most importantly, it demonstrated that empire could be based on prosperity and cultural achievement rather than military force alone, providing a model that would influence imperial government for centuries to come. Chapter 7. The Persian Conquest and Transformation. On a cool October morning in 539 BC, the gates of Babylon swung open without a fight. No siege engines battered the famous walls. No armies clashed beneath the towering ziggurat. No flames consumed the greatest city of the ancient world. Instead, Cyrus the Great of Persia entered the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire as he claimed to have entered every city in peace, amidst joy and jubilation. This bloodless conquest marked not just the end of Mesopotamian independence, but the beginning of a new kind of empire, one that would transform the ancient world through tolerance rather than terror. The rise of Persian power had been remarkably swift. Only 20 years earlier, the Persians had been vassals of the Median Empire, paying tribute to kings in Ecbatana and playing a minor role in the politics of the Iranian plateau. But Cyrus, whose name meant shepherd in the ancient Persian language, had proven himself to be a shepherd of peoples on an unprecedented scale. Through a combination of military skill, diplomatic genius, and religious tolerance, he had built the largest empire the world had ever known. The Persians belonged to the great family of Indo-European peoples whose migrations had transformed the ancient world over the course of 2 millennia. They were related to the Greeks, the Celts, the Germanic tribes, and the peoples of India, sharing linguistic and cultural traditions that distinguished them from the Semitic peoples who had dominated the ancient Near East. But unlike many other Indo-European groups, the Persians proved remarkably adept at absorbing and building upon the civilizations they encountered. Cyrus' conquest of Media in 550 BC had given him control over much of the Iranian plateau and brought him into contact with the great powers of the ancient world. His subsequent defeat of Croesus of Lydia in 546 BC had extended Persian power into Asia Minor and brought enormous wealth into the Persian treasury. But the conquest of Babylon was different in both its scope and its implications. Mesopotamia was not just another territory to be added to the empire, but the ancient center of civilization itself, the land where writing, law, and urban life had first developed. What made Cyrus' approach to empire different from that of his predecessors was his policy of religious and cultural tolerance. Rather than imposing Persian customs and beliefs on conquered peoples, he actively supported local traditions and even participated in local religious ceremonies. In Babylon, he took care to honor Marduk and the other Mesopotamian gods, presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate king chosen by the gods to restore proper order to the land. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in the ruins of Babylon in the late 19th century, provides insight into this revolutionary approach to imperial government. In this document, Cyrus claims that Marduk himself selected him to rule Babylon because the previous king Nabonidus had neglected the proper worship of the gods. Cyrus promises to restore traditional religious practices, rebuild damaged temples, and return displaced populations to their homelands. Modern scholars sometimes call this document the first Charter of Human Rights, though it was primarily a work of political propaganda designed to legitimize Persian rule. One of the most famous actions described in the Cyrus cylinder was the release of the Jewish exiles and their return to Jerusalem. This event, which made Cyrus a hero in Jewish literature and earned him the title of Messiah, or Anointed One, was part of a broader policy of supporting local religious traditions throughout the empire. The Persians understood that allowing peoples to maintain their own customs and beliefs was more effective than attempting to impose uniformity by force. The administrative system that Cyrus and his successors developed to govern their vast empire was as innovative as their religious policy. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a satrap or governor who was responsible to the king. These satraps were generally Persians or Medes, but they worked closely with local officials who understood regional customs and languages. The system combined central control with local autonomy, allowing the empire to function effectively despite its enormous size and cultural diversity. Communication throughout the empire was maintained through an elaborate system of roads and relay stations that allowed royal messengers to travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks. The royal road, which stretched from Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa in Iran, was over 1,600 miles long and could be traveled in less than a week by royal couriers using fresh horses at regular intervals. This communication system made possible a level of administrative control that had never before been achieved in such a large territory. The Persian approach to law was as tolerant as their approach to religion. Rather than imposing a uniform legal code throughout the empire, they allowed local legal traditions to continue while establishing royal courts to handle disputes involving imperial interests or conflicts between peoples from different regions. This legal pluralism recognized that different communities might have different needs and customs while maintaining overall imperial authority. Under Cyrus's successors, particularly Darius I, the Persian Empire reached its greatest extent and developed its most sophisticated institutions. Darius reorganized the entire imperial system, standardized weights and measures throughout the empire, established a common currency, and created a professional bureaucracy capable of governing diverse populations efficiently. He also founded a new capital at Persepolis, designed to serve as a symbol of Persian power and a center for imperial administration. The construction of Persepolis demonstrated the cosmopolitan character of the Persian Empire. Craftsmen and artists from throughout the empire contributed to its decoration, creating a synthesis of architectural and artistic traditions from Egypt to Central Asia. The famous relief sculptures that line the walls of the audience hall show delegates from every part of the empire bringing tribute to the king, but they are depicted with dignity and respect rather than as conquered enemies. Economic life throughout the empire flourished under Persian rule. The Persians maintained and expanded the trade networks that had developed under previous empires, but they also created new opportunities for commercial exchange. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency facilitated trade across vast distances. The construction of roads and harbors improved transportation. Most importantly, the Persian policy of tolerance and local autonomy created stable conditions that encouraged investment and commercial development. The impact of Persian rule on Mesopotamian civilization was profound, but generally positive. The ancient cities were maintained and, in many cases, expanded. Babylon remained one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the empire, serving as a center for trade, scholarship, and religious activity. The cuneiform script continued to be used for local administration and commercial transactions, while Aramaic gradually became the common language for communication throughout the empire. Persian religious policy allowed Mesopotamian traditions to continue and evolve. The ancient gods continued to be worshipped in their traditional temples, though they were gradually syncretized with Persian deities. Zoroastrianism, the Persian national religion with its emphasis on ethical dualism and the worship of Ahura Mazda, influenced local beliefs but did not replace them. This religious synthesis created new forms of expression that would influence later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought. The Persian period also saw important developments in astronomy and mathematics, building on earlier Babylonian achievements. The stable conditions created by Persian rule allowed scholars to make systematic observations and calculations that extended over many decades. These astronomical records were later used by Greek scientists like Hipparchus and Ptolemy, and they provided the foundation for medieval Islamic astronomy. Cultural exchange flourished under Persian rule as never before. The empire brought together peoples from Egypt to India, from the Greek cities of Asia Minor to the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. Ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions spread throughout the empire, creating new syntheses and innovations. Greek sculptors worked on Persian monuments, Mesopotamian astronomers influenced Indian mathematics, and Egyptian religious concepts spread throughout the Near East. Yet the Persian Empire, for all its achievements, was not destined to last forever. Its very success created new challenges. The empire was so large that effective central control was difficult to maintain. Local governors gradually gained more independence, sometimes ruling their provinces like independent kingdoms. The Persian military, which had been supreme in the 6th century BC, gradually fell behind developments in Greece and Macedonia. Most critically, the Persian policy of tolerance, while generally successful, did not create the kind of emotional loyalty that could withstand serious military defeat. The end of Persian rule in Mesopotamia came not through internal collapse but through external conquest. In 334 BC, Alexander the Great of Macedonia began his campaign against the Persian Empire, and within 10 years he had conquered territories from Egypt to India. Alexander's victory at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, fought on the plains of northern Mesopotamia, effectively ended Persian rule over the ancient centers of civilization. Yet the Persian achievement was not forgotten. Alexander himself adopted many Persian governmental practices, and his successors continued to use Persian administrative methods throughout their kingdoms. The Parthian and Sasanian empires that later ruled Iran explicitly claimed to be heirs to the Achaemenid tradition. Most importantly, The Persian model of tolerant multicultural empire influenced every subsequent attempt at universal government, from Rome to the Islamic caliphates to modern federal states. The Persian conquest of Mesopotamia marked the end of the region's political independence, but it also marked the beginning of its integration into world civilization. Under Persian rule, the ancient knowledge and traditions of Mesopotamia spread throughout the known world, influencing the development of Greek philosophy, Jewish theology, and Islamic science. The land between the rivers, which had given birth to civilization, now became part of a global community that encompassed much of the ancient world. Chapter 8. Daily Life and Culture. Across the Ages. The sun rises over Uruk in 2500 BC, as it had for centuries, casting long shadows across the mud-brick houses clustered around the great ziggurat. In the household of Ur-Nanshe, a prosperous merchant, the day begins before dawn as his wife Ninlil supervises the servant grinding barley for the morning bread. Their eldest son practices writing his name in cuneiform on a clay tablet, while their daughter helps prepare offerings for the household shrine. Life in ancient Mesopotamia was both familiar and strange, combining timeless human concerns with the unique circumstances of the world's first urban civilization. The rhythm of life in Mesopotamian cities was dictated by the agricultural calendar that governed all ancient societies, but it was modified by the requirements of urban living and the complex religious calendar that honored dozens of gods throughout the year. People rose at dawn, worked during the cooler morning hours, rested during the heat of midday, and resumed work in the evening. The working year was punctuated by festivals, religious observances, and the seasonal activities of planting and harvest that connected even city dwellers to the agricultural foundations of their civilization. Housing in Mesopotamian cities varied greatly according to social class and historical period, but certain features remained constant throughout the region's history. The fundamental building material was mud brick, made from the clay that was abundant along the riverbanks and dried in the fierce Mesopotamian sun. These bricks were strong and durable when properly made, but they required constant maintenance due to the effects of rain, wind, and the occasional flood. The typical Mesopotamian house was built around a central courtyard that provided light, air, and a workspace for various domestic activities. Rooms opened off this courtyard, with the most important rooms receiving the best ventilation and light. Houses of the wealthy might have multiple courtyards, elaborate decoration, and specialized rooms for different activities. The poorest inhabitants of the cities lived in single rooms or shared courtyards with other families. The wealthy merchant's house might include separate quarters for men and women, reflecting the complex social hierarchies and gender roles that characterized Mesopotamian society. The men's quarters typically included a reception room for conducting business and entertaining guests, while the women's quarters were more private spaces focused around domestic activities. Children generally remained in the women's quarters until boys were old enough to begin formal education. Privacy as we understand it did not exist in ancient Mesopotamia. Most activities took place in communal spaces, and even wealthy families lived in close proximity to their servants, slaves, and extended family members. The household was the basic economic unit of society, encompassing not just parents and children, but also grandparents, servants, slaves, and sometimes business partners, or clients who lived under the protection of the family patriarch. Food and drink were central concerns in Mesopotamian daily life, as they are in all agricultural societies where famine was a constant threat. The basic diet consisted of bread made from barley, the grain best adapted to the salty soils of southern Mesopotamia. This was supplemented by dates, onions, garlic, and other vegetables that could be grown in irrigated gardens. Fish from the rivers and canals provided protein, as did sheep and goats raised by nomadic peoples on the margins of the agricultural zone. Beer was the standard drink throughout Mesopotamian history, consumed by people of all ages and social classes. Made from barley and flavored with various herbs and spices, beer was safer to drink than water in cities where sanitation was primitive. The Mesopotamians developed numerous varieties of beer, from light brews suitable for daily consumption to strong ceremonial beers reserved for religious festivals. Wine made from grapes was available but expensive, since grapes had to be imported from the mountains or the Mediterranean coast. The preparation of food was women's work, though wealthy households might employ professional cooks for special occasions. Bread was baked in cylindrical ovens heated with wood or dried animal dung. Meat was roasted over open fires or stewed in pottery vessels. The elaborate feasts described in royal inscriptions required careful planning and coordination, with dozens of courses served to hundreds of guests over the course of many hours. Clothing in Mesopotamia was made primarily from wool and linen, though silk was available to the wealthy after trade connections with China were established in later periods. The basic garment for both men and women was a long tunic that could be worn alone in hot weather, or supplemented with cloaks and other outer garments when the weather was cooler. Social status was indicated by the quality of the cloth, the elaborateness of the decoration, and the presence of jewelry and other accessories. Women's clothing was generally more elaborate than men's, reflecting both their role in displaying family wealth and the complex social meanings attached to female appearance. Wealthy women wore elaborate headdresses, jewelry made from gold and precious stones, and garments decorated with intricate embroidery. Cosmetics were widely used by both men and women, including eye paint made from antimony and rouge made from red ochre. Personal hygiene was important in Mesopotamian society, both for health reasons and because of religious requirements for ritual purity. People bathed regularly in rivers, canals, or public bathhouses. Soap was made from animal fat and ash, and various oils and perfumes were used to improve personal appearance and mask body odors. Dental care was primitive but not entirely neglected, with recipes surviving for various tooth powders and mouth rinses. The family was the fundamental social unit throughout Mesopotamian history. But family structures varied according to period, social class, and ethnic tradition. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement between families rather than a romantic union between individuals, though mutual affection was certainly hoped for and valued. Marriages were often arranged when the children were quite young, though the actual ceremony might not take place until both parties had reached adolescence. Divorce was possible but complicated, requiring legal proceedings and financial settlements that could be lengthy and expensive. Women could initiate divorce proceedings under certain circumstances, including a husband's failure to provide economic support or his commission of certain crimes. Children belonged to the father's family, and divorced women generally returned to their father's households unless they had independent means of support. Children were economic assets in Mesopotamian society, providing labor for family enterprises and security for aging parents. Boys were preferred because they could carry on the family name and inherit property, but girls were also valued for the marriage alliances they could create and the economic contributions they could make. Child mortality was high, and families typically had numerous children in hopes that some would survive to adulthood. Education was available primarily to boys from wealthy families, though some girls from elite households might receive basic literacy training. The curriculum was demanding and standardized throughout the Mesopotamian world, beginning with learning to write cuneiform script and progressing through mathematics, literature, law, and religion. Students spent years copying and memorizing classic texts, gradually developing the skills needed for careers in government, business, or religious administration. The working life of ordinary people varied according to their occupation, social class, and the historical period in which they lived. Farmers worked the fields outside the cities, following agricultural cycles that had been established for millennia. Craftsmen worked in specialized workshops, often organized into guilds that regulated their trades and provided mutual support. Merchants traveled throughout the known world, establishing trading relationships that could span generations and cross ethnic and political boundaries. Slavery was an accepted part of Mesopotamian society throughout its history, but the treatment of slaves was regulated by law and custom. Slaves could own property, engage in business, and even buy their freedom under certain circumstances. Many slaves were prisoners of war or people who had sold themselves or their children to pay debts, but others were born into slavery and knew no other life. The relationship between masters and slaves was often complex, involving elements of both exploitation and protection. Religious observance was woven into every aspect of daily life in Mesopotamia. Each household maintained shrines to various gods, and daily offerings were considered essential for maintaining divine favor. The calendar was filled with religious festivals that provided occasions for celebration, community gathering, and the temporary reversal of normal social hierarchies. Major festivals could last for days, involving elaborate processions, theatrical performances, and communal feasting. The Mesopotamians believed that the gods were actively involved in human affairs, and that proper religious observance was necessary for both individual and community prosperity. Illness, business failure, or personal misfortune were often attributed to divine displeasure that could be remedied through appropriate rituals, offerings, or ethical behavior. Professional priests and priestesses served as intermediaries between humans and gods, performing daily rituals and interpreting divine will through various forms of divination. Art and entertainment were important aspects of Mesopotamian culture, though they served religious and political purposes, as well as providing aesthetic pleasure. Music was particularly important, with professional musicians attached to temples and royal courts. Instruments included lyres, harps, drums, and various wind instruments. Dancing was performed at religious festivals and important social occasions, often with elaborate costumes and choreographed movements that told mythological stories. Visual arts included sculpture, painting, and the decorative arts of jewelry making, textile production, and metalwork. Most surviving art served religious or political purposes, decorating temples and palaces with scenes of divine activity, royal achievements, or mythological narratives. But ordinary people also decorated their homes with simple paintings and sculptures, and they owned jewelry. decorated pottery and other objects that combined functional and aesthetic purposes. Games and sports provided recreation for people of all social classes. Board games similar to backgammon have been found in archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia, along with dice and other gaming pieces. Hunting was both a practical necessity and a royal sport, with elaborate hunts organized for the entertainment of kings and their courts. Wrestling, boxing, and various ball games provided physical exercise and competitive entertainment. The position of women in Mesopotamian society was complex and varied according to historical period, social class, and ethnic tradition. In general, women had significant legal rights, including the ability to own property, conduct business, and seek divorce under certain circumstances. Some women achieved positions of considerable power and influence, serving as high priestesses, successful merchants, or influential members of royal courts. Yet women were also subject to various restrictions and expectations that limited their autonomy. They were generally expected to marry and bear children, and their primary role was seen as supporting their families rather than pursuing independent careers. Women's behavior was more strictly regulated than men's, particularly in matters relating to sexuality and religious observance. The famous law code of Hammurabi reflects these complex attitudes, providing both protections and restrictions for women depending on their social status and circumstances. Trade and commerce were the lifeblood of Mesopotamian civilization, connecting the region to the broader world and providing the wealth that supported its cultural achievements. Mesopotamian merchants were renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill, reliability, and extensive networks. They established trading posts from Anatolia to India, developed sophisticated banking and credit systems, and created commercial law that facilitated complex international transactions. The marketplace was the heart of every Mesopotamian city, a bustling center where people from different ethnic groups and social classes came together to buy and sell goods, exchange news, and participate in the broader life of their community. Markets were regulated by law and custom, with standard weights and measures, quality controls, and dispute resolution procedures that protected both buyers and sellers. Technology and craftsmanship reached high levels of sophistication throughout Mesopotamian history. Metal workers developed techniques for creating alloys, casting complex shapes, and decorating objects with intricate designs. Textile producers created fabrics of remarkable quality and beauty using techniques that would not be improved upon for millennia. Architects and engineers built monuments that still impress modern viewers with their scale, beauty, and technical accomplishment. Yet for all their achievements, the people of ancient Mesopotamia remained vulnerable to the forces that threatened all agricultural societies. Floods, droughts, diseases, and wars could disrupt the delicate balance that made urban civilization possible. The Mesopotamians understood this vulnerability and developed religious and philosophical traditions that emphasized both human achievement and human limitations, creating a worldview that was both realistic and profound. Chapter 9. The End of an Era and Legacy. On a spring morning in 331 BC, two armies faced each other across the plain of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia. On one side stood Darius III of Persia, commanding a force drawn from across his vast empire, the last remnant of the political tradition that had governed the ancient Near East for 2 centuries. On the other side stood Alexander of Macedon, leading the disciplined phalanxes and cavalry squadrons that would soon sweep away not just Persian power, but the entire political order that had shaped the ancient world since the time of the first Sumerian kings. The battle that followed was more than a military engagement. It was the collision of two worlds. The Persian Empire represented the culmination of 3 millennia of Near Eastern imperial development, a synthesis of traditions reaching back to Sargon of Akkad and Hammurabi of Babylon. Alexander represented something entirely new, a Greek-Macedonian synthesis of military technology, political organization, and cultural vision that would transform the ancient world from Britain to India. Yet the encounter between these two forces was not simply a matter of old versus new. Alexander himself had been profoundly influenced by Persian ideas and institutions. His teacher Aristotle had studied Persian philosophy and science. His father Philip had adopted Persian military innovations. Alexander's vision of universal empire, while expressed in Greek terms, was fundamentally Persian in inspiration. The conquest of Persia by Alexander was thus both an ending and a beginning, the death of one imperial tradition and the birth of another that combined elements from both. The immediate aftermath of Gaugamela was the collapse of organized Persian resistance in the heartland of the empire. Babylon opened its gates to Alexander, as it had to Cyrus 2 centuries earlier. The Persian capital of Persepolis was captured and, in a moment that Alexander may have regretted, burned during a night of drunken celebration. The last legitimate Achaemenid king, Darius III, was murdered by his own followers as he fled eastward, ending a dynasty that had ruled for over 2 centuries. But the death of the Persian Empire did not mean the end of Persian influence. Alexander, despite his youth and his Greek education, quickly recognized the value of Persian administrative methods and cultural traditions. He adopted Persian court ceremonial, married Persian noble women, and encouraged his followers to do the same. He retained Persian administrators in their positions and maintained the satrapy system that had governed the empire. Most importantly, he continued the Persian policy of religious and cultural tolerance that had been one of the sources of imperial strength. The transformation of Mesopotamia under Hellenistic rule was gradual but profound. Greek culture, with its emphasis on rational inquiry, artistic naturalism and political participation, gradually blended with ancient Near Eastern traditions of divine kingship, cosmic order, and religious observance. The result was a distinctive Hellenistic civilization that was neither purely Greek nor purely Persian, but something entirely new. The most visible symbol of this cultural synthesis was the city of Seleucia on Tigris, founded by Seleucus I in 305 BC as the capital of the Seleucid Empire that controlled much of Alexander's Asian conquests. Built across the river from ancient Babylon, Seleucia was designed according to Greek planning principles but decorated with art that combined Greek, Persian, and Mesopotamian elements. The city quickly grew to enormous size, rivaling Alexandria in Egypt as one of the largest cities in the Hellenistic world. Greek influence was particularly strong in the areas of philosophy, science, and education. Greek schools were established throughout Mesopotamia, teaching not just the Greek language and literature, but also Greek approaches to mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. These schools attracted students from throughout the region, creating a cosmopolitan intellectual culture that combined the best elements of both traditions. Yet ancient Mesopotamian traditions proved remarkably resilient under Hellenistic rule. Cuneiform script continued to be used for commercial and religious purposes well into the Common Era. Ancient temples were maintained and rebuilt, with Greek rulers following Persian precedents in supporting local religious traditions. Babylonian astronomy, building on observations accumulated over many centuries, continued to develop and actually reached new heights of sophistication during the Hellenistic period. The encounter between Greek and Mesopotamian intellectual traditions was particularly fruitful in the areas of astronomy and mathematics. Greek geometric methods combined with Babylonian computational techniques to produce new levels of precision in astronomical prediction. The work of astronomers like Hipparchus and Ptolemy, which dominated European astronomy until the time of Copernicus, was built on foundations laid by Hellenistic scholars working in Mesopotamian cities. The Parthian conquest of Mesopotamia in 141 BC brought new rulers, but did not fundamentally alter the cultural patterns established during the Hellenistic period. The Parthians were themselves Iranians who claimed to be heirs to the Achaemenid tradition, and they continued many of the policies that had characterized Persian rule. Greek culture remained influential in the cities, while Iranian and Mesopotamian traditions continued to flourish in the countryside and in religious contexts. Christianity entered Mesopotamia during the 1st century AD, brought by missionaries who traveled the trade routes that connected the region to the Roman Empire and India. The new religion found fertile ground in communities that had been prepared by centuries of cultural synthesis and religious tolerance. Early Christian communities in Mesopotamia developed distinctive traditions that combined Christian theology with local cultural practices, creating forms of Christianity that differed significantly from those that developed in the Roman Empire. The Sasanian conquest of Mesopotamia in 224 AD marked the final restoration of Iranian rule over the region, ending nearly 5 centuries of Hellenistic and Parthian dominance. The Sasanians explicitly claimed to be heirs to the Achaemenid tradition and attempted to restore Persian cultural and religious practices throughout their empire. Yet even they could not completely reverse the cultural changes that had occurred during the intervening centuries. Under Sasanian rule, Mesopotamia became once again a center of learning and cultural creativity. The famous Academy of Gondishapur attracted scholars from throughout the known world, becoming a center for the study of medicine, philosophy, and science. Sasanian art and architecture reached new levels of sophistication, creating monuments that influenced artistic development from Europe to China. The Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia in 637 AD brought the final end to the political traditions that had governed the region since Sumerian times. Yet even this dramatic change represented more continuity than rupture. The early Islamic State adopted many administrative practices from the Sasanians, who had themselves inherited them from earlier empires. Islamic scholars translated and preserved much of the accumulated learning of earlier civilizations, ensuring that Mesopotamian achievements in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy would influence later intellectual development. The cultural legacy of ancient Mesopotamia extends far beyond the end of the region's political independence. The innovations first developed in Sumerian cities continue to shape human civilization today. Our system of measuring time in 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles derives from Mesopotamian mathematics. Our alphabet evolved from scripts first developed to write cuneiform texts. Our legal traditions trace back to codes first promulgated by Mesopotamian kings. The literary legacy of Mesopotamia is equally profound. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great work of literature, continues to be read and studied today for its insights into the human condition. The flood story that appears in Genesis derives from much older Mesopotamian traditions. The Psalms and wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible show clear influences from Mesopotamian literary models. In the realm of religion, Mesopotamian influences can be traced in traditions as diverse as Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Zoroastrianism. Concepts of divine judgment, cosmic order, and individual responsibility that were first articulated in Mesopotamian texts became fundamental elements of later religious thought. The institutional patterns of priesthood, temple organization, and religious calendar that characterized Mesopotamian religion provided models that were adopted and adapted throughout the ancient world. The political legacy of Mesopotamia is perhaps most profound of all. The concept of empire itself, as distinct from simple conquest, was first developed in Mesopotamia. The administrative techniques, legal principles, and ideological justifications that made large-scale political organization possible were pioneered in Mesopotamian cities. Every subsequent empire, from Rome to the modern nation-state, has built upon foundations first laid in the land between the rivers. Modern archaeology has revealed the full extent of Mesopotamian achievements, recovering texts and artifacts that demonstrate the sophistication of the world's first urban civilization. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century opened up entire libraries of ancient literature, legal codes, business records, and personal correspondence that provide unparalleled insight into the daily life and thought of ancient peoples. Yet much remains unknown about Mesopotamian civilization. Many sites remain unexcavated, and new discoveries continue to revise our understanding of this remarkable culture. The recent conflicts in Iraq have unfortunately led to the destruction or looting of many important archaeological sites, representing an irreplaceable loss to human heritage. The environmental legacy of Mesopotamian civilization is more problematic. The intensive agriculture that supported the region's dense population gradually led to soil salinization and ecological degradation that contributed to the decline of urban life in later periods. Modern irrigation projects in the same region have repeated many of the same mistakes, suggesting that the environmental challenges faced by ancient Mesopotamians remain relevant today. The social and economic patterns first established in Mesopotamian cities continue to influence human organization today. The division of labor, the use of money and credit, the organization of markets and trade networks, and the development of professional classes all have their origins in Mesopotamian innovations. The tensions between urban and rural life, between individual achievement and collective responsibility, between innovation and tradition, that characterize modern societies were first experienced in Mesopotamian cities. Perhaps most importantly, Mesopotamian civilization demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of human organization. The achievements of Mesopotamian science, literature, law, and politics showed what humans could accomplish when they learned to cooperate on a large scale and to accumulate knowledge across generations. The eventual decline and fall of Mesopotamian power showed that even the greatest civilizations are fragile and temporary, subject to forces beyond their control. The story of Mesopotamia is thus both inspiring and sobering. It is the story of human creativity and achievement, of the development of writing and law, of cities and empires, of literature and science. But it is also the story of human limitations, of environmental degradation and political failure, of wars and conquests and the inevitable passage of time that reduces the mightiest empires to ruins in the desert. Yet the legacy endures. In every book we read and every law we obey, in every city we inhabit and every school we attend, we participate in traditions that began in the mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia. The land between the rivers gave birth not just to civilization, but to the human story itself, creating the patterns of life and thought that continue to shape our world today. In that sense, Mesopotamian civilization never truly died, but lives on in every achievement of the human spirit. That concludes our journey through the full story of ancient Mesopotamia, from the first Sumerian cities to the Persian conquest and beyond. Over 4,000 years of human achievement, innovation and struggle played out in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the cradle of civilization, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more historical content. Let us know in the comments what aspects of Mesopotamian history you found most fascinating, and what other ancient civilizations you'd like us to explore in future videos. Until next time, sleep well, and dream of the ancient cities where human civilization first learned to reach for the stars.